Okay, well, my name's Elaine Sharland. I'm Professor of Social Work Research here at Sussex University, and welcome everyone to my professorial lecture. I'm delighted you're here, and I'm delighted to be here. The title of my talk today is Social Work Research, Identity, Interdisciplinarity and Impact. A little bit of a mouthful. Now, when the university sent me guidance about preparing a professorial lecture or crafting a lecture, they said, make the title arresting but not too cryptic. Well, that put paid to my plan to call it what I first thought of, which was Knowing Me, Knowing You. But I do want to tell you briefly about why I'd fancied that title. Firstly, it seemed to capture what I'll try to do today, which is not just to tell you about some of the research issues that I've been interested in over the years and why they've been important to me in my research journey, but also to communicate this to you in a way that I hope, if it doesn't arrest you, at least engages you, whether or not you're involved with social work research. My second reason for fancying that title is because all three of my three themes, identity, interdisciplinarity, impact, are really about how we come to know ourselves as researchers and as disciplines, and how we can come to know and work with other disciplines and with those in the world out there who share our commitment to make a difference in some way. And the third reason that I fancied Knowing Me, Knowing You is, as the aficionados among you might have spotted, it's my small tribute to ABBA, and through ABBA to the Department of Social Work and Social Care here at Sussex. My first departmental Christmas outing here at Sussex was to an ABBA tribute concert, and the memory of it still captures for me the huge sense of fun as well as the collegiality of the social work team here that I've been lucky enough to work with most closely for the last 14 years. Having said this, as I started warming in my mind to my ABBA theme, various other ABBA song lines started intruding into my thoughts. Waterloo, finally facing my Waterloo, SOS. So on balance, I decided to stick to the rules, and here's what we have. Okay. Title or no title, the great thing about for me about today is that I get to talk uninterrupted for 45 minutes, and then no one gets to answer back. How often does that happen? But while I'm at it, I do want to keep all of you on your toes too. So I'd like to alert you now, before I get going any deeper, that in no particular order, each of the following will be mentioned at some point during my talk. Megaphones, Pat Boone, the American crooner of the 1950s, dung flies, and full-bodied red wine. So your task is to keep your eyes and ears open and make sure you spot them. Okay, well, I started out doing a history degree at university, and in my second year I studied the rise of fascism and Nazism in mid-20th century Europe. And what appalled but also fascinated me was what Wilhelm Reich called the mass psychology of fascism. That is, how a hideous ideology took hold in the minds of ordinary people, how the political, the social and the psychological all melded in a way that could shape, and in this case destroy, the lives of people, of families and of communities. So I decided to switch in my final year to social and political sciences. And by the time I emerged, I was pretty well soaked in everything from grand political and social theory of Marx and Durkheim to Piaget's developmental psychology, to Freudian ideas or understandings about what sits beneath our conscious minds, all seasoned with a healthy dose of second-wave feminist critique about how women are positioned in our society. And in particular, I'd become interested in mothers and in how, as I saw it, ambivalent and gendered role expectations impacted on their well-being and their relationships with their children. For me, this seemed a deeply political and social issue. I didn't particularly think about it as science. But as it happens, I landed my first research job at the snappily titled MRC Unit for the Development and Integration of Behaviour at Cambridge. Now, that unit had been set up by the renowned animal behaviourist Robert Hind, who'd become interested in the behaviour of human animals, and in particular human children and their parents. So the unit was tucked in under the University Department of Zoology. We had a monkey house and wallabies. I went to seminars where people moved seamlessly between discussing the social behaviour of children and the social behaviour of dung flies. I might as well have landed on Mars. What's more, I could barely understand the language that people spoke, and in particular, I couldn't understand why nothing at all was significant unless it was statistically significant. And I had to go to evening classes to find out what that meant. What I eventually cottoned onto was that I'd inadvertently tripped across disciplinary and paradigm boundaries into a world where there were apparently laws of cause and effect that underpinned human behaviour, and these laws were waiting to be discovered through rigorous scientific testing of hypotheses. Whereas my social science, I realised, felt like a much more interpretative one. It was about trying to understand how people made sense of their lives and lived them. So this was my first absolutely formative experience of what it meant to have a sense of research identity, a way of approaching the world and a sense of belonging, or in my case, not quite belonging, to a community of researchers who approach the world similarly. I should say the experience was also a very productive one for me. I learnt to do quantitative research and statistics, and it also awoke my interest in interdisciplinarity, which has stayed with me ever since. Now, when I left that job, I went to work with the late Cathy Irwin, also in Cambridge, but in the much more psychosocially oriented Centre for Family Research, on a project that combined my interests in history and parenting. We were looking at how popular advice literature during the 20th century changed, reflecting both changing social and political contexts and also growing research knowledge about children's development. One thing we wrote about was the gradual recognition in this popular literature in the early 1980s that parents could harm their children. Now, this recognition followed quite belatedly after the discovery in the medical world in the 1960s of what was originally called battered child syndrome, and subsequently slowly came to be referred to as child abuse, child maltreatment, and latterly child protection safeguarding. As it happens, our work coincided with what many of you will remember as the Cleveland child sexual abuse scandal in 1987. During the previous 15 years, public attention had been drawn to a series of tragic cases of child deaths at the hands of parents or carers. Maria Colwell in Brighton in 1973, followed by Jasmine Beckford, Kimberly Carlisle, and sadly more. Now, professionals, especially social workers, had been castigated for doing too little too late and in too unjoined up a way. And this, of course, has remained the refrain ever since, with Victoria Climbié, Baby Peter, and others since. But Cleveland was different from what had gone before. This was the first very public case where the spectre was child sexual, not child physical abuse. Just to remind you, 121 children who were suspected to have been sexually abused were removed from their homes, only for 94 of them to be returned not long later. In the wake of this, the Department of Health commissioned a programme of 20 research studies to examine how child protection was undertaken and how effective it was, and from this collective evidence to draw messages from research about how policy and practice might be improved. Now, I was appointed to work on one of those studies at the Institute of Child Health in London. So I now found myself actually in a department of psychological medicine, back to a paradigm of scientifically testing cause and effect. This time we were using a randomised controlled trial to explore which of two hospital-based treatments was most effective, worked best for children who were sexually abused and their families. From there, I went on to lead another project, another study in the same programme, this one looking at how routine professional interventions happened when children were referred to social services for suspected child sexual abuse and the impact that these interventions had. Well, that study started out at the Department of Psychiatry at Oxford University, but partway through we moved it to the Department of Applied Social Studies, where at the time social work research and social work teaching sat at Oxford, because on balance it seemed to fit better there. Now, I'll come back to this study later, but my point here is to show you, first of all, how this whole area of research sits right across several different disciplines and several different practice fields. And secondly, to show you how it was quite by accident that I found myself becoming a social work researcher. The big step towards my going native as a social work researcher happened next when I was appointed to a lectureship in social work at the University of Southampton in 1994. Joan Orme, who was head of department then, and her colleagues took a punt on me. At the time in the UK, it was rare to appoint to an academic social work post someone who wasn't a professionally qualified social worker. It's more common now, and I'm pleased to say that our truly multidisciplinary social work team here at Sussex is a testament to this. But my situation was still unusual in 2001 when I was appointed to a social work lectureship here at Sussex. I'm telling you this partly because, in addition to Joan and Jackie, I want to thank all my bona fide social worker colleagues at Sussex, especially the most long-standing ones, Carol Kedwood, Imogen Taylor, Susie Bray, Michelle Lefebvre, Barry Luckock and Kath Holmstrom, for all the nurturing that they've done over the years to enable me to reach the point where people often enough say to me, "Do you know, I'd never have thought you weren't a social worker." I think it's meant as a compliment. But also I'm using my own example because I want to begin here to use it to open up my three key themes. So starting with identity, the first thing to alert you to is that defining what it is that distinctively characterises the social work discipline or social work research is quite difficult. But what's not contested is that fundamental to this identity is its connectedness to the world of social work practice, whether or not, I would argue, the researchers themselves are social work practitioners, and whether or not our research is empirical or conceptual. Walter Lorenz, who's one of my heroes in the academic social work field, expresses this connection very well. He talks about the task of social work practice and social work research as fulfilling the ambition of what Charles Wright Mills called in 1946 the sociological imagination. It's to help people understand the meaning of their epoch for their own lives, and to make a difference in the quality of human life in our time. Now that, picking up another of my themes, is all about having an impact. Social work research is about having real-world impact on social welfare, social well-being, social justice, social protection. And it's with that in mind that I can also open up my third theme, interdisciplinarity, by offering you an observation that was made by the Kellogg Commission in 1999. They were looking into how universities could become more engaged with the world around them. And they noted, with some irony, society has problems, but our institutions have disciplines. So taking these observations as my springboard, I'm going to turn now to some of my own work, if I may, to develop each of these themes a bit further. Okay, so in 2008, the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK announced the need for a fundamental step change in the breadth, depth and quality of the UK research base in social work and social care. They argued, there's the quote, that we need to develop a much stronger research evidence base in the UK to underpin policy and practice in social work and social care. Now, the backdrop to this was that social work in the UK is a well-established profession and with a strong professional identity and increasingly working interprofessionally. But it's still a relatively new research discipline, and it draws from many other more established disciplines for its knowledge base. The majority of the social work academic workforce, as I've mentioned, has conventionally come from practice, and social science research, especially quantitative, has not been a prominent part of their training. There's also been a long-standing underinvestment in this research field in infrastructure, especially by comparison with health. So, for example, the 2008 research assessment exercise had identified strengths, especially in qualitative research and participative research with service users. But nonetheless, it showed that much of our work was small-scale, short-term, not as robust as it might be, and not that well able to tell us what works. I should say that the 2014 Research Excellence Framework has demonstrated improvement since then, but in 2008 that was the lay of the land. So the ESRC decided to appoint a strategic advisor to come up with a plan to build capacity across the academic workforce in order to produce and deliver a higher quality research evidence base. They were also clear from the outset that this had to be done with a strong commitment to innovative interdisciplinary approaches to strengthening the research base in social work and social care. Now, that language will be familiar to many of you, and of course Sussex University, from its foundation in the 1960s, was in the vanguard of developing academic interdisciplinarity. More recently, I think it's fair to say that interdisciplinarity has become a buzzword, sounding loud and clear across most universities, most disciplines, and most funders. As Dan Sperber, the social scientist, rather wryly puts it, interdisciplinarity is used to describe and praise courses, research projects, or grant proposals as routinely as full-bodied is used to describe red wine. Did you spot the reference? Okay, well, I got the strategic advisor job, and to be honest, I think one of the main reasons I got it was because I was seen to be both an insider and an outsider. Someone who might speak the language of and have credibility with both social work researchers and members of other related disciplines whom the ESRC were keen to engage with the problem and in the solution. Among other things in that role, I conducted a UK-wide consultation with key informants from the social work discipline and from a range of neighbouring disciplines, among them health and medicine, sociology, psychology, criminal justice, and various others. And one of the first things I noticed when people spoke to me about interdisciplinarity was that they were talking about multiple and often quite different things. So for some, interdisciplinarity meant simply having generic social science underpinnings. Or it could mean integrating ideas and approaches from different disciplines into the same inquiry. It could mean extending the reach or the relevance of research from one discipline into other disciplines or fields. It could mean actively collaborating with members of different disciplines on the same project. Or it could just mean importing or exporting researchers from one discipline to another. So my first point about all this is that we may want to promote any or all of these things, but it helps to be clear what it is we're trying to achieve so that we can work out the best way to do it. Then it gets more complicated. And before I expand on this by showing you what some of my respondents said to me about interdisciplinarity, it is a tongue-twisting word, isn't it? I want to introduce you to one or two other people's ideas about it that I've used to make sense of this issue when I've written about it. So Moti Nisani, for example, has pointed out that the arguments that are made in favour of interdisciplinarity are broadly on grounds of its intellectual, social and personal rewards, while Graham Huggan has observed that what he calls the anxiety of interdisciplinarity rests on exactly the same grounds. Also, Andrew Jackson has alerted us that interdisciplinarity is parasitic on disciplinarity. It cannot exist without it. So the points to note here are that without having some sort of disciplinary identity, it's hard to do interdisciplinarity. And with interdisciplinarity come both opportunities and threats, which are intellectual, social, personal. Now, for social work, as you'll see, this presents an exciting but also a challenging scenario. So here are some of the things that my informants said to me. Starting first with the anxieties or the threats of interdisciplinarity, you'll see that social work academics were saying, and I'll paraphrase here a bit, we need disciplinary coherence, we need distinctiveness, we need habits of thought, professional socialisation that's rooted in practice. How could researchers be described as engaging in social work research if they're not social workers? That individual, I obviously hadn't told that I wasn't a social worker. Another quote says, the danger is that social work practice could be colonised by other disciplines which don't acknowledge the culture and the values of practice. And a third one, that the danger is that research will be that could be conducted by social work researchers will be conducted by others who have both more status, more funding and more and a bigger skills base. And so social work research continues to be the poor relations. Meanwhile, members of other related disciplines express their anxiety about it in these terms. So again, I'll paraphrase a bit, but the first one is saying, if you're an economist or whatever else you are, you don't get brownie points to do social work research. You're not likely to publish in a high-impact journal in your own field, which is what people here are expected to do. People need rewards for coming out of silos. They follow money. There aren't exactly big bucks in social work research. And this last quote I will read, it's my favourite. With vulnerable groups, like the sort of groups social work deal with, they're hard to reach to get into research studies in the first place, hard to keep in, hard to find. If they move, they float in and out. And there's a perception this is a very problematic kind of field, which actually does the opposite of attract you. It makes you think it's really intricately difficult, and how would we measure it? I don't understand it. Run away, run away, run away. So, in contrast, on the plus side, some social work folk were saying, social work research needs interdisciplinarity. It's integral to our survival. Social work barely has a knowledge base if we take away all that we've drawn from other disciplines. It also, increasing interdisciplinarity, increases and builds our research capacity, and it reflects the interdisciplinarity of the nature of much social work practice. And the last quote is saying, social work has something really distinctive to say in answer to some of the key pressing problems that are concerns for us in the 20th century. Social work speaks to these themes: health, well-being, population diversity, social inclusion, security, conflict, justice, etc. And we need to be in there making our contribution with and to other disciplines. And colleagues from other disciplines were saying, and I think this here, they're echoing really what the Kellogg Commission was saying 10 years before, there's a variety and a range of disciplinary skills that you need to answer any research questions. You need qualitative and quantitative skills, you need economics, you need to deploy this battery of skills, combine them in a way that is appropriate to answer the right question in the right ways. And the second quote they're saying, we can't do without disciplinarity. It's a means to an end, and that end is analysing complex social problems, processes and structures. So I hope this gives you some idea of the complexity both of disciplinary identity and of the challenges and opportunities of interdisciplinarity, for social work research in particular. Now, it's good to be able to report too that the recent Research Excellence Framework confirmed that social work research has now grasped some of these opportunities quite well. But I also think that some of the issues raised here have a more enduring and a wider resonance for how we think about interdisciplinarity across the piece. So here I want to introduce you just briefly to the work of Armin Krishnan, which I've also used and tried to take a bit further when writing about this. Krishnan argues that it's helpful to see the question of interdisciplinarity to look through a variety of different disciplinary lenses at the question of interdisciplinarity, to see what it's about and how it can happen. So to start with, if we look, I hope you can see this well enough on the slides, if we look at how disciplines work philosophically or intellectually, we can see that they offer us distinctive paradigms or ways of understanding, distinctive authority to make claims about what's true. If we look at them anthropologically, disciplines are the space for forms of cultural practice, for shaping collective values and identity. They're the tribes we can belong to. They enable us to distinguish between us and them. If we look at disciplines as forms of socio-political organisation, disciplines act as regulatory regimes. They offer distinctive rules, incentives and rewards, and they operate through relations of power. They hold and share or don't share intellectual, social and material capital, money. Educationally, disciplines are the spaces where we learn how to think as we think and do what we do. They're where we learn our identity and the tools of our trade. Historically, disciplines are dynamic. They evolve, often from roots in other disciplines. They consolidate, they fragment, they reconfigure, and the boundaries between them fuse and unfuse. Some people actually argue that we are, in contemporary times, in a post-disciplinary era. I don't actually agree with that. I think it's important to take this historical perspective and watch those dynamics of shaping and reshaping, integration and disintegration as they evolve. Lastly, if we look in terms of management economics, we can see that disciplines often compete, but also need to come together to meet market demands for knowledge supply. They're increasingly required to demonstrate that they can have real impact in the world. Their funding often depends on this now, and funders increasingly don't recognise disciplinary boundaries. Now, I think that developing these kinds of understandings about who we are as disciplines, where we've come from, how we work, how connected we already are to other disciplines, and how connected we can be, are crucial to all of us if we want to maximise the difference we can make to the world we want to inform. And that brings me on to research impact. Specifically social work research impact, which I'd like to dig into a bit deeper now, as this is something I've been thinking and writing about fairly recently. Now, I've already argued that social work research is about doing the work of the sociological imagination, about making the difference to the quality of human life in our time. So this, of course, means that we're not just ideally placed, but it's our raison d'etre to stimulate real-world impact. And as the Research Excellence Framework panel recently commented, there are some good signs that we're doing this already. I won't read it, but there's the quote. I hope you can see it. Of course, social work research often has the advantage that it's directly commissioned by government or service providers to inform or justify their policies and practices. And even if they haven't commissioned it, they're commonly on the lookout for research that does this for them. However, this relationship between research and its commissioners or would-be users can be double-edged, and I want to give you a couple of examples from my own work, if I may, to illustrate this. So I mentioned earlier the project that I undertook or did for the Department of Health in the mid-1990s, looking at how routine professional interventions happened when child sexual abuse was suspected and referred to social services, and whether this could be improved post-Cleveland. Now, my colleague Barry Luckock, and he's given me permission to say this, has more than once described this project to me as very interesting and also very influential in that, I quote, "It set back child and family social work for about 20 years." Well, for research impact, I guess you could call that a coup of sorts. Now, actually, I don't altogether agree with Barry, but I can see his point, and what he's referring to is this. We looked at child sexual abuse referrals across one region during 1 year, and we followed them up for a year. We found that far more cases of alleged or confirmed child sexual abuse than expected, 52% of them, involved abusers who were known to and trusted by the family, but were not immediate family or household members. We also found that 45% of confirmed sexual abuse cases were closed within a month of referral. And that 70% of children and parents were left with unmet needs after child protection interventions, with 50% of children clinically depressed and 35% of parents reporting being in a poor mental state. Now, these findings were not unconnected to each other. So most of the children who had been abused but were left with no support afterwards were also children whose abuser was outside their family and household. Once alerted to the abuse, their parents were often devastated but also highly protective and made sure the child was no longer in danger. Children's social services at the time were configured to channel referrals through one of two separate channels. One for children who now needed protecting, and the other for those who didn't need protecting but had difficulties which meant they were legally categorised as in need. Those 45% of confirmed sexually abused children whose cases were closed within the month were no longer considered in need of protection. There was no way of moving them across into the other channel that might respond to their or their families' needs and distress surrounding the abuse. So, case closed. Now, it turned out that very similar messages emerged from several of the other studies in the programme, and of course my colleague Barry was referring to these collective messages, not just mine. Now, in response to this, the Department of Health produced a volume of synthesised messages from research that went out to social services departments countrywide, and they changed policy and procedures to what was called refocused children's services. This was to allow all children to enter the system through the same route and, in theory, move within the system for their needs, whether they were needs for protection or for other kinds of support, to be met. However, there were also wider resource and policy contexts in which all this took place. So one unintended consequence was that some resource got shifted away from child protection towards a plethora of services intended for children more broadly in need or vulnerable. And these services were often provided by semi-professionals who didn't have social work training or expertise. Now, arguably, I think the jury's probably still out, but arguably, this may have served children in need of protection less well, and it may certainly have undermined the professional authority and the remit of social workers. So, now my second example of being careful what you wish for when it comes to research impact involves a project that I'm currently involved in, a project called Social Work Over Time, and I'm doing that with colleagues Jonathan Scurfield, Morag Henderson and Sinyi Chung at Cardiff University. We're funded by the Nuffield Foundation. Now, we're an interdisciplinary team, and what we're doing is secondary quantitative analysis of 4 existing longitudinal cohort studies in the UK. These studies follow over many years large samples of children and families who are representative of the general population, looking at many, many aspects of their lives. But what we're trying to compare is those who report receiving social work services with others who seem to have similar profiles but don't get social work. It's work in progress, but the long and the short of it is it's not proving easy for us to identify the beneficial effects of receiving social work over time. Now, there are likely to be some very good reasons for this. Key among them that these data are based on self-report and they weren't collected to look at social work in any detail. So, for example, they don't tell us the specific reason for social work contact, nor the nature of the contact, whether it was voluntary or involuntary. They don't tell us about the intensity or the duration of the contact. But we do know from other sources that in the 1990s and the 2000s, when these data were collected, rationing of resources meant that thresholds for receiving a social work service got higher. So it's quite possible that in many cases what we're seeing is the result of a child and a family experiencing a real difficulty but getting just a one-off phone call or one visit from a social worker and nothing more. So their outcomes could well be the result of not getting what they need rather than getting what doesn't do them any good. Now, our message from this is that we need better data, not necessarily that we need better social work. However, as soon as we started to present these findings publicly, both certain government department representatives and the media were onto it in a flash. This, remember, is in a context where David Cameron had recently announced that the Tories, if they got back in, would ensure that professionals will face up to 5 years in jail if, as he calls it, they turn a blind eye to child abuse. At a time when the social work profession is under attack both from politicians and from the media, the last thing we need is the kind of research impact that adds grist to that mill. Now, those 2 examples are probably at the sharp edge of what I see as some of the wider challenges of how social work research can best forge the kind of connections it intends with the worlds of policy and practice. So the last part of my talk today, in the last part, I'd like to introduce you to some work that I've done recently with Mel Gray, Melina Heinz and Leanne Schubert at the University of Newcastle in Australia. We've been looking at the literature about research utilisation, meaning the travel of knowledge between research and, in this case, professional practice. What we've identified is that until recently there have been 2 fairly distinct discourses about this. The first one is the discourse of evidence-based practice. And this discourse originated in medicine, but has since become predominant, I think it's fair to say, albeit quite contested, in a range of other disciplines, including social work. Now, evidence-based practice is about ensuring that the best possible research evidence informs professional practice. This doesn't mean that research evidence should override all other sources of information that can also inform professional judgment. And indeed, some people prefer to speak of evidence-informed practice for this reason. But conventionally, the model here is that rigorous research evidence of high intrinsic scientific quality is produced by research experts for others to use. And conventionally, there's been a hierarchy here of what counts as rigour, albeit, again, that this pecking order is starting to be, let's say, relaxed in some quarters. So near to the top of this hierarchy are randomised control trials and experimental methods that can test cause and effect and be replicated elsewhere. Considerably lower down the pecking order is the sort of interpretive, qualitative research that explores people's experiences and the mechanisms of change in their lives, which of course is the type of research that is still much more common in UK social work research. This evidence-based practice model does sometimes include involving the research users in the design and the doing of the research itself. But conventionally, this participatory element is relatively limited, has been relatively limited. More often, the model that's been relied on is known as producer push, where high-quality evidence is produced by the research community and then broadcast, hence the megaphone, to the user community. So it's a rather linear process or pathway. And it tends to be done through dissemination strategies, often aimed at educating individuals. Typically, these strategies do involve some forms of knowledge translation. In other words, not just pushing the evidence out there, but translating it into language and formats like pithy research summaries or practice guidance that potential users might find accessible and therefore feel moved to use. But the problem with all this is that there's also quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this approach doesn't always work terribly well. And taking the case of social work, even though connecting the worlds of research and practice is, I've argued, fundamental to its raison d'etre, paradoxically, there's also been a well-recognised gap. Joan Orme and Jackie Powell have called it a circle of resistance, separating the two worlds. So here is where I think it's helpful for us to look at the second discourse that we found in the literature, which is what we call the knowledge production and utilisation discourse. The focus of this is all about making that connection between research and practice. Now, this discourse comes from disciplines like organisational and management science, sociology of science and public health, and it got a huge boost from the work of Michael Gibbons and Helga Nowotny in the early 1990s. They were arguing for a shift from traditional discipline-based research towards interdisciplinary, socially relevant research that's demand-pulled by those who need it, who need to use it. So the core concerns here are with the whole gamut of factors that affect making this connection, in particular the different cultures, contexts and priorities of the communities who produce research and those who might use it. So if we take first the knowledge producing end of the spectrum, we know that academic researchers in the UK do now get rewarded for research impact. But mainly over the years, we've got our brownie points from publishing in prestigious scholarly journals that are rather remote from the rest of the world. It's also very time-consuming, for example, for us to work hand in glove with research users throughout the research process, and it's rather unsettling to let them set the research agenda, much easier to hold on to our own authority and run the show ourselves. Research users, on the other hand, want the kind of research knowledge that gives them usable answers to their questions, and often quickly. So this discourse privileges not just the intrinsic rigour of research, but also its extrinsic utility, usability and value. And at the other end of the spectrum, at the research utilisation or impact end of the spectrum, this approach encourages us to think in a much more nuanced way about, for example, the different stages of research use that we might be looking for, which range from would-be users recognising and picking research up through to understanding it, adopting it, implementing and embedding it. We're also encouraged to differentiate between different types of research use, including instrumental use, that is, directly applying research findings in what's done, to conceptual use, which is more about changed understanding in the real world, to symbolic use, which is really kind of formal endorsement of research messages, but actually not much more than lip service. Now, in terms of what happens in the middle to connect these two ends of the spectrum, the knowledge production and utilisation literature does two things. First of all, instead of envisaging a linear pathway, oops, don't think that worked, that's it. Instead of envisaging a linear pathway to getting research out there to those who might use it, this discourse encourages a much more multi-directional dialogue and relationship-based approach to forging the connection between research and practice. Sometimes this involves what's called co-production of research, meaning that members of both communities are actively engaged in producing the knowledge and creating its impact. Secondly, this discourse, filling in the last space, looks not just to individuals, but importantly to cultures, particularly organisational cultures and resources that are needed to support and sustain this kind of relationship and impact. And what shows up is that this takes, on the one hand, research funders and universities providing the infrastructure, the rewards and the time that's needed to achieve genuine impact. And on the other hand, it takes research user organisations that don't just stick evidence-based protocols or guidance on people's desks, but offer training, supervision, discussion space, and a genuine ethos that nurtures a culture of research, engagement, and use. Now, as it happens, there are some signs that these two discourses or approaches are starting to converge. So supporters of evidence-based practice, for example, they've increasingly started advocating for what they call knowledge brokers or knowledge champions, people who work either within or between research and practice or policy organisations to mobilise the connections between the two. And both discourses have also started coming together in what's become called innovation science. And this focuses, interestingly, on how innovations how organisations can implement and genuinely embed research-based innovations in mainstream thinking and practice so that they become part of the fabric of the system and they're sustainable. Importantly too, both discourses have started to become much more savvy, I'd say, about how all this can be achieved within scarce resource contexts and within political environments that often espouse the use of research evidence, but in reality can be driven by managerialism, quick fixes, or in the case of social work, blame culture too. So to sum up, my argument for social work is that we have nothing to lose and a lot to gain, I think, by looking beyond the discourse of evidence-based practice to some of these wider developments. Fulfilling the ambition of the sociological imagination requires, I would say, that we bring together the research and the practice communities, bring them closer together. We still have some way to go to achieve that, but there are some exciting pointers of the way to go. Now, to round off, if I may, I'd like to go back almost to the beginning of my story and tell you a short tale that comes from my early days in the Animal Behaviour Unit at Cambridge. So, there were two postdoctoral researchers there at the time, and I haven't sought their permission to tell this story, so I won't use their real names. But Sarah, let's call her, was a very bright and dedicated young English woman, and Dan, I'll call him, was a very smart East Coast American. They met at the unit and they fell in love and got married. Dan took Sarah off to meet his family, including in the States, including his great aunt who lived in a retirement home in the Catskills. And when they got there and they sat down for tea, Dan's great aunt asked, and Sarah told her, all about her research on the parenting behaviour of baboons. So Sarah described in great detail how she had spent a year in Tanzania, going every day at the crack of dawn into the forest, picking a tree, standing at the foot of the tree to watch as the baboon in the tree woke up, groomed itself, went off, gathered some food, came back, fed its family, socialised a bit with others, and so on, until nightfall, when the baboon would go to sleep, and so would Sarah, back in her hut, only to get up again the following day and start all over. Sarah explained with great passion how much, as humans, we can learn from baboons about our own behaviour and our own parenting. And Dan's aunt listened, wide-eyed, and afterwards she agreed how fascinating this was, and yes, how much we could learn. And then there was a pause, and she asked, "But tell me, what was Pat Boone doing in a tree?" I love that story partly because it still makes me giggle, and it reminds me of how baffled I was at that time by people around me talking a language I couldn't understand and making connections that I couldn't understand. But I also hope that it captures something of what I've been talking about here today. It's about how important it is to understand who we are as researchers or as disciplines, but not just that, also to communicate effectively with those we're trying to connect with and to understand the worlds that they live in and what makes sense to them. So whether you're in social work or in other fields, for all of you who are interested in interdisciplinary research and in making an impact in the real world, my small take-home message from today is don't forget Pat Boone. Finally, just to close, I would like to say thank you to the many people, too many to mention here, I'm afraid, who've contributed in so many ways to me standing here today. But I do want to single out my very special partner, Richard, along with my sisters and brothers-in-law, Louise and Tony, Susie and Steve, for all their support and all of you for sticking with me. Also want to thank my friend Jenny Shaw for almost daily sustenance, and my late friend and mentor, John Clark. If he's watching somewhere, I hope he's smiling. And lastly, my wonderful parents, Norbert and Sylvia. I reckon they've been looking forward to today for about half a century. So I'm delighted that today's arrived. I hope my mum and dad and all of you have enjoyed it. Thank you.